What if I told you that the perfect family photo, the one plastered across every holiday card, can hide a betrayal so deep it carves a permanent scar? My name is Sarah Miller, and for years, I believed in that picture-perfect facade, especially when it came to my brother David. We shared everything growing up: scraped knees, whispered secrets under starlit summer nights, even the dream of one day owning a little slice of paradise by the ocean. That dream, for me, became a reality: a charming, sun-drenched beach house on the Outer Banks, a place I poured my heart and soul into. But that house, that sanctuary, became the very battleground where our family ties snapped, leaving me to pick up the shattered pieces of my trust. You see, I always imagined David's wedding would be one of the happiest days of my life. I pictured myself there, front row, beaming with pride, maybe even shedding a tear or two as my little brother started his new chapter. Instead, I found myself staring at an embossed invitation addressed to Mr. and Mrs. John Doe, not Sarah Miller. My name was nowhere on the guest list, a cold, hard slap across the face delivered by an elegant cream-colored envelope. I called him, of course, my voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. His response was a clinical, almost robotic explanation about limited seating and family dynamics. Family dynamics? I was his sister, his only sister, the woman who'd helped him through every heartbreak, every bad decision, every single moment he needed me. That phone call ended with a click, leaving me in stunned silence, the weight of his rejection crushing me. The resentment began to fester right then, a bitter seed planted deep in my chest. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself he was stressed, overwhelmed, that it was just a misunderstanding, but the weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with social media posts, vibrant photos of lavish parties, beaming faces. None of them mine. My own mother, bless her heart, tried to mediate, but David was unyielding. He had made his decision, and I, his own flesh and blood, was excluded. The day of the wedding came and went, a blur of forced smiles from my parents and awkward silences whenever my name was mentioned. I spent it alone, at my beach house, ironically, the very place I'd always envisioned celebrating our biggest milestones. The salty air felt heavy with my unspoken pain, the waves crashing against the shore mirroring the turmoil in my heart. Then, just a few months later, came the call that truly set the stage for war. David, with a casualness that chilled me to the bone, informed me that he and his new wife Brenda were planning an extended honeymoon. And where did they intend to stay? My beach house, not as a request, mind you, but as a demand. "It's family, Sarah," he'd said, as if that phrase was a magic wand that erased months of deliberate exclusion. "You're not using it anyway, and we need a place to unwind." The audacity was breathtaking. The man who couldn't find room for me at his wedding now felt entitled to my most treasured possession, my sanctuary, my home away from home. My blood ran cold. The resentment I'd been nursing transformed into a searing rage. This wasn't just about a wedding invitation anymore. This was about a fundamental disrespect, a calculated exploitation. He had cut me out, dismissed me, and now he expected me to open my home, my haven, to him and his new bride, as if nothing had happened. It was a betrayal so profound it felt like a physical blow. The obsession began then, a quiet hum beneath my skin, a relentless drive to reclaim my dignity, to make him understand the true cost of his actions. I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't let this stand. But how do you fight back against someone who believes they are untouchable? Someone who wields family as both a shield and a weapon? The answer, I soon discovered, was far more complicated and far more satisfying than I could have ever imagined. My brother, Michael, had always been a master of manipulation, a virtuoso of emotional extortion. His wedding, or rather my exclusion from it, was just the opening act in a symphony of calculated cruelty. I, Alex, had spent years trying to decipher the twisted logic of his actions, trying to find some semblance of brotherly love beneath the layers of his self-serving ambition. There was none. only a gaping void where empathy should have been. The invitation to his extravagant beachfront ceremony in Malibu never arrived. Instead, a terse text message delivered weeks before the event simply stated, "Keeping it small. Family only." The irony wasn't lost on me. I was his only sibling, his flesh and blood. That single dismissive message felt like a punch to the gut, a cold, hard truth confirming what I had long suspected. I was expendable in Michael's meticulously crafted world. I remember staring at my phone, the screen blurring through unshed tears, the glittering ocean waves from his wedding photos already flooding my social media feed. The sting of betrayal was immediate, sharp, and visceral. For weeks, a suffocating blanket of resentment settled over me. I replayed every childhood slight, every broken promise, every instance where Michael had prioritized his own gain over our bond. It wasn't just the wedding. It was the culmination of a lifetime of being second best, of being the convenient scapegoat, the forgotten sibling. I had poured my heart and soul into supporting him through college, sacrificing my own dreams to help fund his. I had been there when his first business venture failed, offering not just financial support but unwavering emotional solace. And this was my reward. A digital brush-off, a public humiliation. Then came the phone call, a few months after the intimate wedding, a call that would irrevocably alter the course of my life and ignite a firestorm within me. Michael's voice, usually laced with a practiced charm, was unusually strained. He began with a series of forced pleasantries, asking about my job, my life, things he hadn't genuinely inquired about in years. My guard immediately went up. I knew this song and dance. It always preceded a request, a demand, a thinly veiled attempt to exploit my generosity. "Alex," he started, his tone shifting, becoming more direct. "I need a favor. A big one." I braced myself, my grip tightening on the phone. "What is it, Michael?" I asked, my voice flat, devoid of any warmth. He launched into a convoluted story about a new business opportunity, a real estate venture that required significant capital, and an urgent need for a temporary residence in Malibu. He spoke of synergy and market trends, words I knew he used to mask his true intentions. My stomach churned with a familiar dread. "I need to stay at your beach house," he finally blurted out, the pretense of politeness evaporating. "Just for a few months." It would be a huge help. The audacity of it took my breath away. My beach house, the one I had inherited from our grandmother, the only true legacy she had left me. It was my sanctuary, my escape, a place filled with precious memories that Michael had no claim to. He knew how much that house meant to me. It was a tangible link to a woman who had loved me unconditionally, a stark contrast to his own calculated affection. The thought of him, the man who had so casually discarded me from the most important day of his life, now demanding access to my most cherished possession, sparked a furious indignation within me. "My beach house?" I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "The one you never once visited? The one you always claimed was too far out of the way?" His voice hardened. "Don't be dramatic, Alex. It's just a house, and I really need it." This is a crucial deal. The casual dismissal of my feelings, the blatant disregard for my emotional connection to the property, fueled the simmering resentment into a raging inferno. It wasn't just about the house, it was about the principle, the constant taking, the endless expectation without reciprocation. It was about his unwavering belief that my resources, my time, my emotions, were merely tools for his advancement. "You excluded me from your wedding, Michael," I said, my voice rising, the carefully constructed calm shattering. "You made it clear I wasn't family enough for that. But now, when you need something, suddenly I'm your brother again." A heavy silence hung between us, broken only by the distant sound of traffic outside my apartment window. I imagined him on the other end, his face contorted in annoyance, already calculating his next move, his next manipulation. He had always been a master strategist, but this time, he had miscalculated. He had pushed me too far. "Alex, this is different," he finally said, his tone laced with a hint of impatience. "This is business, and frankly, you owe me." "Owe you?" I scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "I owe you nothing, Michael. Absolutely nothing." The conversation quickly devolved into a heated argument, a brutal exchange of accusations and long-held grievances. He brought up every perceived slight, every imagined sacrifice he had made for me, twisting reality to fit his narrative. I, in turn, unleashed years of pent-up frustration, detailing every instance of his selfishness, his callous disregard. The venom in our words was palpable, the chasm between us widening with each angry syllable. By the end of the call, both of us were seething. He hung up first, the abrupt click of the phone echoing in the sudden silence of my apartment. I stood there, trembling, my heart pounding against my ribs, a cold, hard resolve settling over me. The resentment had solidified into something far more potent, far more dangerous. This wasn't just about a wedding or a beach house anymore. This was about a lifetime of being walked over, of being taken for granted. This was about reclaiming my dignity, my worth, and showing Michael that there were consequences for his actions. The game had changed, and I, Alex, was finally ready to play. His voice, usually laced with a practiced charm, was unusually strained, a subtle tremor betraying the carefully constructed facade. He began with an awkward apology, a hollow gesture that felt less like remorse and more like a preamble to a request. I listened, my grip tightening on the phone, a cold premonition settling in my gut. He spoke of unforeseen financial difficulties, of a sudden downturn in his latest venture, a venture he had proudly boasted about just weeks prior. The words tumbled out, a carefully rehearsed narrative designed to elicit sympathy, to pave the way for what he truly wanted. Then came the demand, cloaked in the guise of a desperate plea. He needed a place to stay, a temporary refuge while he sorted out his cash flow issues. Not just any place, of course. He wanted my beach house, the one I had poured my life savings into, the sanctuary I had meticulously crafted after years of hard work and sacrifice. He spoke of its spacious rooms, its idyllic location, its perfect suitability for his needs. A euphemism, I knew, for his extravagant lifestyle, even in supposed financial distress. The audacity of it, the sheer gall, struck me like a physical blow. After excluding me from his wedding, after years of treating me as an afterthought, he now expected me to hand over my most prized possession, my haven, without question. A bitter laugh escaped my lips, a sound devoid of humor. "You want my beach house, Michael?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm, each word a shard of ice. "The one you never once visited, the one you scoffed at when I bought it, calling it a fiscally irresponsible indulgence." The silence on his end was deafening, a rare moment of speechlessness from a man always armed with a glib retort. He stammered, attempting to backtrack, to reframe his request as a temporary loan, a brotherly favor. But the damage was done. The veil had been lifted, revealing the raw, unadulterated entitlement beneath his polished exterior. The conversation spiraled into a heated argument, a verbal brawl fueled by years of unspoken resentments. I unleashed a torrent of pent-up anger, recounting every slight, every betrayal, every instance where he had prioritized his own selfish desires over our familial bond. I reminded him of the college tuition I'd paid, the failed business loans I'd covered, the emotional support I'd offered when his world crumbled. His attempts to deflect, to gaslight, to twist the narrative only fueled my fury. He accused me of being petty, of holding grudges, of not understanding the realities of his high-stakes world. He even dared to bring up our parents, suggesting they would be disappointed in my lack of generosity, a familiar tactic he'd employed since childhood. That particular accusation, the invocation of our deceased parents, was the final straw. It shattered any remaining shred of brotherly affection I harbored. A cold, clear resolve settled over me, replacing the white-hot rage. I ended the call abruptly, the click of the phone echoing in the sudden silence of my living room. The resentment had solidified into something far more potent, far more dangerous. This wasn't just about a wedding or a beach house anymore. This was about a lifetime of being walked over, of being taken for granted. This was about reclaiming my dignity, my worth, and showing Michael that there were consequences for his actions. The game had changed, and I, Alex, was finally ready to play. My initial thought was to simply refuse, to sever all ties and let him flounder. But a deeper, more insidious idea began to take root. Pure refusal felt too simple, too quick an end to years of simmering injustice. Michael had always enjoyed watching others squirm, reveling in their discomfort. Now it was my turn to orchestrate a performance, one he wouldn't soon forget. I spent the next few days in a haze of planning, meticulously constructing a strategy, a slow-burning fuse leading to an inevitable explosion. I knew his weaknesses, his vulnerabilities, the things he valued most, and I knew exactly how to exploit them. The first step involved a series of discreet inquiries, leveraging old contacts and digging into public records. Michael, in his arrogance, had always believed himself untouchable, his dealings opaque. But I knew where to look, the cracks in his perfectly polished facade. I uncovered a web of questionable business practices, a pattern of cutting corners and exploiting loopholes that bordered on the unethical, if not outright illegal. He had always walked a fine line, confident in his ability to charm or bully his way out of trouble. This time, however, he would be walking a tightrope, and I held the shears. I compiled a dossier, a thick file filled with damning evidence, each document a carefully placed domino in my elaborate plan. It wasn't about destroying him financially, not yet. It was about applying pressure, about creating a situation where his carefully constructed world began to fray at the edges. I wanted him to feel the slow, creeping dread, the uncertainty he had so often inflicted upon others. I wanted him to understand, truly understand, the consequences of his actions, not just for a moment, but for an extended, agonizing period. This wasn't just revenge, it was a lesson, delivered with surgical precision. And I, Alex, was the teacher. The conversation with Michael had been a turning point, a stark demarcation line in the sand of my life. His voice, usually so self-assured, had quivered with an unfamiliar desperation. He spoke of unforeseen financial woes, of a disastrous investment that had spiraled out of control, threatening to unravel his meticulously constructed empire. He even mentioned something about his new wife, a woman he had paraded across social media as the epitome of success and beauty, being less than understanding about their sudden downturn in fortunes. The irony was a bitter, satisfying taste in my mouth. He needed a place to stay, he explained. Just for a few months, while he sorted things out. His Malibu mansion was being leveraged, his assets frozen, and the luxurious lifestyle he'd flaunted was crumbling around him. He needed sanctuary, a place off the grid, away from the prying eyes of his socialite friends and the looming threat of creditors. And then, the audacity of it all, he asked about my beach house. My sanctuary, the one place I truly felt at peace, the place he had always dismissed as my little shack. My mind reeled. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, calculating, strategizing, always looking for the angle. He saw my beach house not as a home, but as a temporary solution to his current predicament, a stepping stone back to his opulent life. He genuinely expected me to open my doors, no questions asked, no apologies offered for the years of emotional neglect and the ultimate public humiliation of his wedding. That familiar cold anger, the one I had tried to bury deep, began to resurface, hotter and more potent than ever before. I listened patiently, allowing him to paint a vivid picture of his impending financial ruin. He detailed the intricate web of debts, the legal battles, the potential loss of everything he held dear. He even managed a few well-placed sighs and a strained laugh, attempting to evoke sympathy. But I wasn't buying it. I saw through the performance, recognizing the same manipulative tactics he had employed since childhood. This was his carefully orchestrated plea, designed to extract maximum pity and, more importantly, maximum benefit from me. A silence stretched between us as he finished his monologue, punctuated only by the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore outside my own window. He was waiting for my immediate agreement, my eager offer of assistance. He expected me to be the same old Alex, the dependable, forgiving brother, who always cleaned up his messes. But that Alex was long gone, buried under the weight of years of his betrayals. "Michael," I began, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within me. "That's quite a story." He chuckled, a nervous, almost desperate sound. "Yeah, well, life comes at you fast, right? So, about the beach house. You know, just for a bit. It would really help me out of a bind." His casual presumption, the way he just assumed my generosity, ignited a spark. My plan, which had been a simmering ember of resentment, suddenly burst into a roaring flame. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The opportunity to finally turn the tables, to make him feel a fraction of the helplessness and insignificance he had so often inflicted upon me. "The beach house," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air, allowing the tension to build. "It's a beautiful place, isn't it? Lots of memories there." I deliberately steered the conversation away from his immediate needs, focusing instead on the sentimental value, something he rarely understood. He grunted, clearly impatient with my reminiscing. Yeah, great memories. So, is it free? You're not using it, are you?" His impatience was a gift, a clear indication of his desperation. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face, one he couldn't see but would certainly hear in my voice. "Funny you should ask, Michael. As a matter of fact, it is free, completely available." A sigh of relief escaped him, a sound so profound it was almost comical. "Oh, thank God, Alex. I knew I could count on you. You're the best, bro. Seriously, you have no idea what a lifesaver this is." His effusive gratitude, so rarely directed at me, was a hollow echo. It meant nothing. I let him bask in his false sense of security for a moment longer, allowing him to believe he had won, that he had once again charmed his way out of trouble. This was the setup, the calm before the storm. He was about to learn that relying on me now came with a price, a very specific, carefully calculated price. "However," I interjected, the single word cutting through his relief like a knife. His breath hitched on the other end of the line. The shift in my tone was subtle, yet unmistakable. The air crackled with a sudden unspoken understanding. He knew, instinctively, that the shoe was about to drop. His carefully constructed world, which had just begun to fray at the edges, was about to unravel completely. He was about to feel the slow, creeping dread, the uncertainty he had so often inflicted upon others. I wanted him to understand, truly understand, the consequences of his actions, not just for a moment, but for an extended, agonizing period. This wasn't just revenge. It was a lesson, delivered with surgical precision. And I, Alex, was the teacher. The first lesson was about to begin. The phone call ended abruptly, a click echoing the finality of my decision. Michael, oblivious to the storm brewing, had probably moved on to his next scheme, convinced I was just another pawn in his game. He had no idea the chess pieces were about to be rearranged, and he was no longer the player. I stood in my living room, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor, a strange calm settling over me. The resentment that had festered for so long began to transform, sharpening into a cold, precise resolve. This wasn't about anger anymore, it was about balance, about an equilibrium that had been violently disrupted by his self-serving actions. My first move was calculated, strategic. I contacted my lawyer, a shrewd woman named Sarah, known for her tenacity and discretion. I laid out the situation, detailing Michael's history of financial instability, his propensity for risky ventures, and the precarious state of his supposed business empire. I didn't mince words, painting a clear picture of his manipulative tendencies and the emotional toll they had taken. Sarah listened intently, her expression unreadable, occasionally interjecting with sharp, insightful questions. She understood the nuance of family dynamics, the unspoken resentments that could fester for decades. Her initial assessment was cautiously optimistic. There were avenues we could explore, vulnerabilities in Michael's carefully constructed facade. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and document reviews. Sarah and her team delved into Michael's financial records, unearthing a labyrinth of shell companies, questionable loans, and inflated assets. It was worse than I had imagined. His success was built on a house of cards, constantly on the verge of collapse. He had leveraged everything, including my own previous investments in his failed ventures, to maintain an image of prosperity. The Malibu wedding, the extravagant lifestyle, it was all a desperate attempt to project an illusion of wealth he didn't possess. The depth of his deception was breathtaking, even for me, someone who thought they knew the extent of his duplicity. One afternoon, Sarah called me with a breakthrough. She had uncovered a critical clause in the original loan agreement for his primary business, a clause that gave me, as an early investor and guarantor, significant leverage should he default on certain conditions. It was a detail Michael had conveniently forgotten, or perhaps, in his arrogance, never considered relevant. The look on Sarah's face, a subtle glint in her eye, told me everything I needed to know. We had found the chink in his armor, the precise pressure point. The first lesson was truly about to begin, and it would be delivered not with a bang, but with the quiet, inexorable force of legal precedent. I spent hours poring over the documents, familiarizing myself with every detail, every stipulation. I wanted to understand the full scope of what we were about to do, to anticipate Michael's reactions, his inevitable attempts to wriggle free. The more I read, the clearer it became. His entire financial world was teetering on the edge, and one gentle push from me would send it tumbling. The irony was not lost on me. He had excluded me from his life, dismissed me as insignificant, yet my past support, my forgotten investments, were now the very instruments of his potential undoing. It was a poetic justice I hadn't dared to dream of. The plan began to take shape, meticulously crafted, leaving no room for error. We would not attack him directly, not yet. Instead, we would initiate a series of carefully timed legal maneuvers, each designed to tighten the noose, to create an undeniable sense of impending doom. I wanted Michael to feel the slow, creeping dread, the uncertainty he had so often inflicted upon others. I wanted him to understand, truly understand, the consequences of his actions, not just for a moment, but for an extended, agonizing period. This wasn't just revenge, it was a lesson, delivered with surgical precision, and I, Alex, was the teacher. The first official letter, a formal notice of intent to review his financial holdings based on historical investment agreements, was dispatched. It was innocuous enough on the surface, a standard legal formality, but I knew its true purpose. It was the opening salvo, the first tremor before the earthquake. I imagined Michael receiving it, perhaps dismissing it as a nuisance, another minor obstacle in his grand schemes. He would underestimate me, as he always had. That was his fatal flaw, his consistent underestimation of anyone he deemed beneath him. A few days later, my phone rang. It was Michael, his voice laced with an unfamiliar edge of irritation. "What's this about, Alex? Some kind of audit? Are you trying to cause trouble?" His usual charm was gone, replaced by a thinly veiled aggression. I maintained a calm, measured tone. "Just reviewing some old investments, Michael. Standard procedure." I could hear the frustration building in his voice, the subtle shift in his demeanor. He was beginning to feel the pressure, the first faint whispers of the storm. The game had begun, and for the first time in our lives I was holding all the cards. His voice, when it finally broke, was a brittle thing, stripped of its usual bravado. Michael's carefully constructed facade had begun to crack, revealing the fear lurking beneath. He started by attempting to re-establish dominance, demanding to know what I was truly doing, his words laced with a desperate edge. I simply reiterated my position, calmly explaining that my inquiries were routine, an exhaustive review of our long-standing financial entanglements. The truth was, my inquiries were anything but routine. They were surgical strikes, each one designed to expose a different vulnerability in his financial fortress. I had spent weeks meticulously dissecting every shared asset, every joint account, every investment we'd ever made. What I uncovered was a labyrinth of questionable transactions, shell corporations, and thinly veiled attempts to siphon off funds for his own lavish lifestyle. He had always been clever but never truly brilliant, and his greed had finally outstripped his cunning. My legal team, a formidable force I had assembled in secret, was now armed with irrefutable evidence of his financial malfeasance. The stakes were no longer just about a slighted brother. They were about justice, about reclaiming what was rightfully mine, and about exposing the true nature of the man I once called family. The next phone call came from his lawyer, a slick, expensive-sounding individual who tried to intimidate me with threats of countersuits and reputation damage. I listened patiently, a faint smile playing on my lips. He had no idea the depth of the rabbit hole I had dug. When he finished his bluster, I calmly laid out my case, item by item, each point a devastating blow to Michael's carefully cultivated image. I detailed the offshore accounts, the inflated expense reports, the outright embezzlement. The lawyer's confident tone began to waver, replaced by a growing unease. He knew, as I did, that Michael was cornered. Then came the meeting, a sterile conference room in a downtown high-rise, far from the sun-drenched beaches of Malibu. Michael sat opposite me, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously. Gone was the arrogant smirk, the dismissive wave of the hand. He looked like a cornered animal, stripped of his power, his charm, and his carefully constructed illusion of success. His wife, the woman he had chosen over me, sat beside him, her expression a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. This was the first time she was truly seeing Michael, not the charming, successful man she married, but the deceitful, desperate individual underneath. My lawyer, a stoic woman named Ms. Davies, began to present our case. She spoke with a quiet authority, each word a hammer blow, each piece of evidence a nail in Michael's coffin. She presented bank statements, email exchanges, and recorded conversations that painted a damning picture of his long-standing financial manipulation. The air in the room grew heavy with the weight of revelation, with the undeniable truth of Michael's betrayal. He tried to interrupt, to deny, to deflect, but his words were hollow, his protests weak against the mountain of evidence. I watched him, a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow swirling within me. This wasn't the triumphant moment I had envisioned, not a joyous celebration of revenge. It was a somber reckoning, a painful acknowledgement of a relationship irrevocably broken. The years of slights, the dismissal, the ultimate exclusion from his wedding, all of it had led to this. His carefully constructed life, built on a foundation of deceit, was crumbling before his eyes. The silence in the room was deafening, punctuated only by the rustling of papers as Ms. Davies continued to methodically dismantle his defense. Finally, Michael's lawyer, defeated, leaned over and whispered something to him. Michael's shoulders slumped, his gaze falling to the polished conference table. He had run out of lies, out of excuses, out of options. The game was truly over. He looked up at me, his eyes devoid of their usual malice, replaced by a hollow desperation. In that moment, I saw not the brother who had wronged me, but a broken man, facing the consequences of a lifetime of selfish choices. The emotional arc of resentment, betrayal, and obsession had finally reached its climax, not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating realization of shattered dreams. This wasn't just about financial restitution. It was about the profound, irreversible cost of his actions, a price far greater than any monetary sum. The silence that followed my words hung heavy, a tangible weight in the sterile office air. Michael, for the first time I could remember, seemed truly speechless. The usual bravado had vanished, replaced by a hollow-eyed stare that spoke volumes of his shattered world. He looked at me, not with anger, but with a dawning horror, as if only now comprehending the full scope of the precipice he stood upon. I watched him, a strange mix of vindication and a profound weariness settling over me. This wasn't the triumphant moment I had once envisioned. No grand cinematic revenge. It was just sad. His lawyer, a sharp-suited woman who had maintained a stoic facade throughout, finally broke the quiet. "Michael, we need to discuss your options. This is a serious situation." Her voice was calm, professional, but the underlying urgency was unmistakable. Michael didn't respond, his gaze still fixed on me, a silent plea in his eyes that I had no intention of answering. The years of neglect, the calculated slights, the ultimate betrayal of the wedding exclusion, they had all culminated in this single, devastating moment. There was no going back, no mending what had been so thoroughly broken. I rose from my chair, the subtle creak of the leather echoing in the sudden stillness. "My offer stands," I stated, my voice even, devoid of the emotional turmoil that had once consumed me. "The house is not for sale, not to you, not to anyone else you might try to involve. And the financial restitution for the funds you diverted from our parents' estate, along with the interest, is non-negotiable." I saw a flicker of defiance in Michael's eyes, a desperate attempt to reclaim some shred of his former self, but it quickly faded. He was cornered, exposed, and utterly without leverage. Walking out of that office felt like shedding a skin. The weight I had carried for so long, the simmering resentment and the gnawing obsession, finally began to lift. The air outside felt cleaner. The city sounds less oppressive. I hadn't destroyed Michael, not in the way a vengeful younger self might have fantasized. Instead, I had simply held him accountable. I had forced him to face the mirror, to see the true reflection of his actions, stripped bare of all the charming lies and convenient excuses. Weeks turned into months, the legal proceedings were arduous, but I remained steadfast. Michael, despite his initial shock, eventually rallied, attempting various legal maneuvers to avoid his responsibilities. Each attempt was met with my unwavering resolve, backed by irrefutable evidence. He tried to paint me as the bitter brother, the one who couldn't let go of a childhood slight. But the truth, cold and unyielding, was on my side. The documents, the financial records, the undeniable paper trail, they all spoke a language Michael couldn't manipulate. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call. It was Michael. His voice when he spoke was a shadow of its former booming self. There was no anger, no bluster, just a quiet resignation. He conceded. He would comply with the restitution, and he would drop his claims regarding the beach house. There was no apology, not explicitly, but the tone of his voice conveyed a defeat so profound it felt like one. He had lost everything he valued. His carefully constructed image, his financial stability, and any lingering hope of reconciliation. The beach house, my sanctuary, remained mine. I spent more time there, finding solace in the rhythmic crash of the waves, the salty air, and the endless horizon. It was no longer just a property, it was a symbol of my resilience, a testament to the fact that I had not allowed Michael's actions to define me. The financial restitution, when it finally came through, was significant, but it felt almost secondary. The true victory wasn't in the money, but in the reclaiming of my peace, my self-respect, and my future. I didn't dance on Michael's grave, metaphorically speaking. There was no joy in his downfall, only a quiet understanding of the justice that had finally been served. Our relationship, or what was left of it, was irrevocably fractured. There would be no more holiday dinners, no more strained family gatherings. That chapter of my life was closed, definitively. The lessons learned were etched deep. Trust, once broken, is incredibly difficult to mend. Family, while often a source of comfort, can also be a wellspring of profound pain. But most importantly, I learned the power of standing firm, of valuing myself enough to demand what was right, even when it meant confronting someone I once loved. The bitterness had faded, replaced by a quiet strength. The scars remained, a reminder of the battle fought, but they no longer bled. I was free, finally, to build a life on my own terms, unburdened by the shadow of my brother's choices. The future, for the first time in a long time, felt truly open, filled with possibilities that were entirely my own. The air in the courtroom hung heavy, thick with unspoken words and years of resentment. I watched David, my brother, across the aisle. His face was pale, drawn, a stark contrast to the smug confidence he'd worn for so long. The judge's voice, a monotone drone, laid out the facts, the evidence, the undeniable truth of his schemes. Every detail, every lie he'd spun, every dollar he'd tried to steal was meticulously unraveled. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash, one I'd spent years anticipating. My heart, which had been a tight, painful knot for what felt like an eternity, began to loosen. Not with joy, not with triumph, but with a profound, almost dizzying sense of release. This wasn't about winning anymore, it was about the truth finally seeing the light of day. When the gavel finally struck, echoing through the silent room, the verdict was clear. David was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud and attempted extortion. He would serve time, and the beach house, my sanctuary, was legally, unequivocally mine. A wave of exhaustion washed over me, deeper than any fatigue I'd ever known. The fight had consumed me, turning me into someone I barely recognized. The obsession, the constant strategizing, the sleepless nights spent poring over documents and legal advice. It had all taken its toll. As I walked out of that courthouse, the bright afternoon sun felt almost blinding. It was a new day, but I felt strangely hollow. The justice I'd craved, the revenge I'd sought, tasted more like ash than victory. Weeks turned into months. David was in prison, his life irrevocably altered by his own greed. Our parents, heartbroken and bewildered, struggled to reconcile the son they knew with the man who had done such terrible things. I tried to reach out to them, to explain, but the chasm between us had grown too wide. They saw me as the one who had sent their son away, unable to grasp the depths of his betrayal. That was a wound that might never heal. I returned to the beach house, the place that had been the epicenter of this storm. It stood silent, serene, untouched by the ugliness that had swirled around it. I walked through its familiar rooms, the scent of salt and old wood filling my senses. For so long, this house had been a battleground, a symbol of everything I stood to lose. Now, it was just a house again, a home. But it felt different. The joy, the simple peace I once found there was tainted by the memory of the fight. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, I sat on the porch swing. I thought about David, about the boy we once were, building sandcastles on this very beach. The resentment, the betrayal, the obsession, they had been powerful forces, driving me forward. But now, with the fight over, those emotions felt heavy, cumbersome. They had served their purpose, but they no longer belonged to me. I realized then that true closure wasn't about David's punishment or my victory. It was about letting go of the anger that had become such a constant companion. It was about accepting that some relationships, no matter how deeply rooted, could be irrevocably broken. The beach house was mine, yes, but its true value wasn't in its ownership. It was in the lessons it had forced me to learn about myself, about family, about the cost of holding on to bitterness. The path to healing was long, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. There were scars, deep ones, that would always remain. But for the first time in a very long time, I felt a flicker of hope. I had fought, I had won, and I had survived. Now it was time to rebuild, not just my life, but my spirit. To find peace not in revenge, but in forgiveness. Starting with myself. The waves crashed against the shore, a steady, rhythmic reminder that life, despite its storms, always finds a way to move forward. And I finally was ready to move with it.